Alrighty, friends, welcome back. Sorry I was gone for a little while. I'm coming off a little sickness, as you can tell from my voice. I also obviously had our first episode of my podcast last Friday with my roommate. We're going to try to have one out again this week. We just got to see when he's available. And also, we've been doing a lot of work on my computer just to make sure I can still make these videos. I'm going to be getting a new camera and things like that as well. But again, obviously things take time, and I'm working in the parameters I have with my job and everything. Like I said last week, it's going to be a tough week for me. I had 9 days straight, almost 12. So this is my first chance to actually sit down and do a video. So thank you all for being so patient with me. I really appreciate it. So today we're going to be watching and reacting to the Sabaton song, Defense of Moscow. Alright, friends, welcome. So, like I said, we'll be covering today Defense of Moscow. So let me do a quick little background for everyone, for those of you that don't know what Defense of Moscow is about. Defense of Moscow is mainly about the Battle of Moscow. So, on June 22nd, 1941, the German army, the Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, and Luftwaffe all invaded the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa. Now, the reason this is so significant is, one, this now opened a two-front war for the Germans, which Hitler had actually not wanted, which is why he was mainly trying to knock out the British first with Operation Sea Lion, which obviously never went to fruition after the Battle of Britain failed. But also, his mentality was, okay, I'll build the Atlantic Wall. That will keep the British at bay. The Italians are fighting in North Africa, so that's not my concern as much. I've already seized the Balkans, so now is my time for Lebensraum, living space for the German people, and I'm going to move east into the Soviet Union. Now, you're probably saying to yourself, well, Tim, that's stupid. Why would he do that? Napoleon did the same thing and he failed. Exactly. The whole plan was, the only thing he had going for him in this plan is, one, his generals, such as Heinz Guderian, von Rundstedt, and even people like Erwin Rommel, were very good strategists and tacticians, but also he had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty, which stated that neither party would attack each other. It was a non-aggression pact. However, he obviously was not against breaking this non-aggression pact. So on June 22nd, 1941, thousands upon thousands of German Wehrmacht, Panzer brigades, the German Navy, as well as the Luftwaffe, all crossed into the Soviet Union to begin its push towards Moscow, Leningrad, and where the army would be defeated, Stalingrad. Now, the Soviet Union was caught by surprise. Joseph Stalin himself actually would spend something like a week in his office in the Kremlin, some people thinking he was going to kill himself. You know, generals were calling him out because what had happened was Stalin ordered purges of his generals because a lot of them were from the past. A lot of them served back when the army was the Imperial Army. He entrusts them, you know, as he often does. He didn't think they were communists or socialists, so he removed them. He only had a handful of good generals remaining, and his men were being overrun, obviously, because the Wehrmacht Blitzkrieg was pushing through Russia. Now, the next part of the plan for the Germans of Barbarossa was something called Operation Typhoon. Operation Typhoon was a two-pincer attack on Moscow. Now, there are contemporaries who often say, had von Paulus's army not gone to Stalingrad and joined this offensive, it would have been different. Stalingrad was not only kind of a vanity thing for Hitler, Stalingrad also controlled the Volga, because before the Soviet Union, it was called Volgograd, as it is called today. The Volga is a very large river in southern Russia. With the Volga in their control, the Germans could take over all of the southern parts of Russia. So that's often a subject of debate with the idea of what the Germans could have done. But an executive order was given out, and I forgot what it was. I feel so stupid because it was like a very important order. But an executive order was given out called the No Retreat Order. this pretty much gave power to Soviet commissars in the army to shoot or execute anyone for cowardice in not defending the motherland. So, Defense of Moscow is about the Battle of Moscow, which started on September 30th, 1941, and ended January 7th, 1942. This will be a Russian victory. They held, thanks to people like Georgy Zhukov, who would later become the man who reversed the war, and attacked Germany. But I don't want to give too much away because I do want to stop during the song and discuss these things. So let's get into it.
Russia 1941, they don't let it long. We stand our ground, 1,000,000 strong. We are ready for the strike. Face the army of the Reich, 1,000,000 strong. This is our land, they don't belong. Here Marshal Zhukov's and Stalin's orders. Defend the motherland, Moscow shall not fall.
So, a lot there. 1,000,000 strong. So pretty much what happened was the Soviet army just started flooding soldiers. If you ever see the movie Enemy at the Gates, there's a great scene. It's very similar to what happened in Moscow. That, of course, is more about Stalingrad. But pretty much what was happening was they were just flooding troops from the eastern provinces back to the west to face them. They were sending troops to Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Moscow. And this was because these three cities were pretty much the hubs that the Germans needed to seize in order to maintain control. It's very clear that the Russians don't just surrender if their capital falls. Napoleon taught us that. But it was very important to take these cities tactically before winter kicked in. Because, again, the army can just entrench if it really comes down to it. And with as awful as this is to say, Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, these countries were giving support. They weren't countries. They were protectorates of the Soviet Union. They were satellite states. But there were groups in these countries that were supporting the Germans. So the mentality was, if we take these three cities, we can hold out the winter, and then we could start a new offensive in the spring and finish everyone off. But obviously, Moscow is... it's often called the holy capital of Russia. That's where Russia started. Russia was I believe the Principality of Muscovy at first. So the idea of losing Moscow was unthinkable even to the Soviets, who were by nature an atheist country. It was not something they were willing to do. So they, as of the 1st of October 1941, they had 1,229,000 men on the field. And the Germans were attacking with 1,184,000. Now, yes, the Russians had more, but obviously, Wehrmacht overrun. The Germans were clearly in kind of a tactically superior position at this time, and that's why it was very important that the Russians flooded as many troops as they could to defend the city. So I like the idea of them showing the civilians. That was true. Stalin gave an order, because at this point Stalin came out of his room, sat down with his cabinet and staff, and Zhukov said, we need to hold here. We can't pull back. We can't be like Tsar Alexander, who retreated to St. Petersburg when Napoleon invaded. If we lose Moscow, we lose it all. So Stalin said, order the population to start building defenses, and that's what they did. You had women and children and elderly, all manner of people were coming out. They were digging these trench systems. They were putting up barbed wire, planting mines, anything they could do to prepare Moscow for this attack. And they weren't going to, this was their home. They weren't being evacuated. They were like, we're going to stay in the city. It's our home. But, it was very important to have that. The Germans would do that later on in the war, because most of the German defenses during the World War II were created by slave labor. Whether it's prisoners of war, concentration camp victims, it was all slave labor. It wasn't until the Russians were overrunning them did the actual German people have to start digging trenches. But this was a stronger sense of nationalism, which, to be perfectly honest, is always very fascinating about Russia, because it was a communist nation, and nationalism is kind of a no-go. But the Soviet Union definitely had their nationalism.
Face the bullets of their guns, Russia's daughters and her sons are the brave who stand against the typhoon wave. From the mountains and the plains, coming thousands on the trains, day and night.
I'm sorry, stop again. I like seeing that part about the typhoon. Sabaton has this great thing that they always are able to work every aspect of the history into it. Like I said earlier, the German operation was called Operation Typhoon. So, brace for the coming storm, the typhoon approaches. I just love how they use the actual facts in it. And that's just me. Sorry.
Night, they're rolling in to join the fight. From Kazakhstan to Magadan, call of the motherland, Russia shall prevail. Standing for command, the blood for the homeland. Hear the mother's call, rise for the storm. Moscow will never give in, there is no surrender. Force them into retreat and into defeat.
So this is another reason I like to use ASCotters videos. Again, Sabaton's Defense of Moscow video is fantastic. It's a great video. I'm going to link it like I always do along with the lyric video. It's great. It doesn't illustrate the brutality that was really going on this front. Of the European front, the Russian front was the worst. It was the most brutal. I will say this, of World War II, the worst front was the Pacific. Because the way the Imperial Japanese Army fought was extremely tooth and nail. They, banzai attacks, kamikazes, horrifying. The Russians and Germans were so violent because there was a hatred. It wasn't, a great scene in All Quiet on the Western Front, which is obviously about World War I, is when Paul, the main character, he stabs a French soldier, and as the man's dying, he's comforting him and being like, we could have been brothers in another life. Why did they make us do this? Why? And another good scene is in the movie Waterloo, which is obviously about the Battle of Waterloo. One of the British soldiers breaks out of the squares during the charge of the French cavalry, and he starts screaming, why do we do this? Why, we don't even know each other. Why do we do this? The Russians and the Germans hated each other. There was a deep-seated hatred for the Germans, which it goes back to World War I, obviously. The Kaiser, Germany and Russia actually used to have a very good relationship. Otto von Bismarck, who did a billion different things, at one point was the ambassador to Moscow, and he lived in Moscow while Tsar Nicholas's father, Alexander III, was growing up as a Tsarevich. And the two men grew a great admiration and friendship. And, something that kept the peace for a long time in Europe was Otto von Bismarck. Because he was able to, yes, Germany kind of offsetted the balance of power with the German Empire, but he didn't want war because he thought everyone's just going to gang up on us. So he was able to keep this alliance with the Russians. But Kaiser Wilhelm II, after he removed Bismarck from power, did nothing but show animosity towards the Russians. And it caused the hatred between the Russians and Germans to the point that was one of the reasons people were very opposed to Tsar Nicholas marrying Alexandra, because she was German. So the hatred, the best way to describe this is pretty much like when the Austrians invaded France during the French Revolutionary Wars. There was a deep-seated hatred between these countries. And the animosity is very clear in these videos, point-blank artillery fire. It's obviously, this is a movie, but it's showing very good rendition of how brutal the fighting really was. Okay, now let's get into this real quick, because this is something I find ironic. Because one of the biggest myths of World War II is in the first few days of it. This idea of the Polish cavalry charging like Uhlans, Lancers, towards panzer brigades. It's not what happened. The Polish cavalry were actually light infantry. So what they would do is they would ride into a position, dismount, fight, remount, pull out. Whereas on the Eastern Front, you would actually have these situations that you would have full-out cavalry charge supporting artillery, which again, it was in a very similar way. They were there to be mobile infantry to support the artillery and tanks, but I find it funny because that's, I think, one of the greatest myths, and people often insult the Polish about that, but the Russians were doing the same things. Actually, and not to bring politics or world events into this, Ukraine and Belarus and Georgia and all these countries that the Germans steamrolled over because obviously they needed to get through them to get to Russia. The Ukrainian Kazakhs fought against the Germans, and some fought with the Germans. The issue was a lot of these countries did not want to be under Russian control. So when the German army came through, they volunteered to fight for the Germans because they wanted to remove the Soviets. And, they were using cavalry just as much as anyone. The Germans used cavalry. That was one of the reasons they moved so quickly. It's this kind of thing that we look at it through a modern lens and we judge. But the thing is, 1941, that was not uncommon. We're only 30 years, not even 30 years past World War I. We were using cavalry in World War I to move artillery and infantry as well. It just not to this scale. But before I rant on. Alright, so I like that they showed, if any of you noticed, they actually showed the map of the counteroffensive. Ironically, Zhukov, who I would say, there's a lot of times, we as Americans, or we in the West, often say the best general of World War II was Eisenhower. Eisenhower was not a good general. Eisenhower was a good politician. Chris from Vlogging Through History, one of my channels that influenced me to do this, often says this. Eisenhower was a good politician. He knew how to coalition build. He knew how to make friends. Whereas Zhukov was a good field commander. One of his best tactics He was the one who introduced the doctrine of artillery to Russia. The doctrine of artillery is this idea that you bombard, send the infantry in to clean up, and then just keep moving forward. It actually was copying the Blitzkrieg, but whereas the Blitzkrieg would use mechanized infantry as well, the Russians were just like, obliterate everything and move forward. That's all we need to do. Obliterate everything and move forward. We can deal with the ramifications after. The army will come in and clean things up. So I often say Zhukov was one of, if not the best generals of World War II. I put him on tier with people like Patton and Montgomery and Rommel. These very good, and even Guderian, these very good generals and tacticians on the field. But, the Battle of Moscow will bring the end of Operation Typhoon. And the end, pretty much, the failure of Moscow. If they took Moscow, we could sit here and say the what ifs all day. It is strongly believed, however, had Moscow fallen, the Germans probably would have been in a better shape when the spring would come and they would start their offensive. But the fact that they did not take Moscow, that gave time for the Russians to shear up their lines, rally their armies, and concentrate everyone around, Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Moscow to begin their offensive. Minsk, the biggest tank battle ever, would happen after the Battle of Moscow. So, it's definitely this part of history that we here in the West, don't talk about. Every year they do this big parade that looked very similar to clips in this video for V-Day, which in Russia, World War II is not known as the Second World War. It's known as the Great Patriotic War, which to some level it was, because it was a war of annihilation. The Germans, the whole point of the German invasion was to annihilate the Russians and have Germans settle Russia, Lebensraum. But the Russians celebrate it as a Great Patriotic War, and every year they do a big parade. I believe it's in May. I believe it's for May Day. They do this huge parade that, it looks just like that. The president of Russia, or, whatever you want to call him, who, will sit there and take the review. And it's interesting because, I talked about the horses before. It used to be done that the commander-in-chief of the Red Army or the Soviet Army would ride a horse. Zhukov was actually a master equestrian, and that's how he actually started his career in the Imperial Army as a cavalryman. So I think that's always a very interesting fact. But that was Defense of Moscow. All right, friends. So that is Defense of Moscow. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, the reaction. Again, I am sorry. I've been missing. I'm struggling still to talk. Like I said, I'll try to do a podcast tonight, but sorry. Thank you so much for standing by me. If you enjoyed the content, please like, share, and comment. If you're returning to the channel and not yet subscribed, or if you're a new viewer, I please ask you to join our ever-growing community. I thank you so much again for joining us, and we will see you in the next one.